Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today I'm going to be covering the topic that I think has probably been the most requested one in Dominaria Week, that being the functioning, or lack thereof, of the new card, Serra Paragon. If you've been on the internet recently, you might have heard some buzz that this card does not in fact grant the triggered ability that makes you exile the card and gain 2 life if it dies. And I'm here to confirm that that is in fact exactly what happens. I'm going to talk about exactly why that is in this episode and give some examples of what we might be doing in order to fix this issue. Ready? Let's get started. Okay, so the whole crux of this problem comes from the fact that we have this rule here, which says that anytime an object moves from one game zone to a different game zone, then it becomes an entirely new object with no memory or connection to its previous existence. And so what that means is that if we have one object, for example, in our graveyard, and we were to move that object onto the stack or onto the battlefield, then it's going to become a completely new object with no connection to its previous self. Obviously, that's not aligned very well with the goal of Serra Paragon, which is to give that ability to the creature as it goes from the graveyard to the battlefield. And so in order to make this card work the way that it's supposed to, we would need to have some sort of justification for retaining that ability as we move from zone to zone. Now, fortunately, as you saw when I brought that rule on screen earlier, there are exceptions to the general rule that you become a completely new object with no access to any information about the object that used to be in the previous zone. And so we're going to take a look at those exceptions and see if we can identify any of them that look like they would be helpful for this specific situation. All right, so this is the first of the exceptions that we're going to be talking about, and you can see that if an effect is going to move an object from one zone into a public zone, then other parts of that effect can find that object and apply to it. So this is pretty good, and it definitely does seem like the sort of thing that we might be looking for to help us out here, especially in the case of playing the land from your graveyard. However, I want to point out one very important thing, and that is that an effect is not putting the land onto the battlefield. Rather, the thing that is putting the land onto the battlefield is the game action you take of playing the land. Now, it is true that there is a continuous effect that is modifying the rules of the game, which enables you to take that action, but the effect itself is not causing the land to move onto the battlefield. I made another video where I talked about a similar pedantic distinction that ended up making the same big difference in a ruling, and you can take a look at that if you'd like some more details about exactly why that's the case, or another example of something like that working. But the bottom line is that in the case of playing a land from your graveyard, that is not an effect that is moving a card into a public zone, so this exception does not actually apply to that situation. You can make a similar argument for the case of if you were going to play a permanent spell from your graveyard, and that is indeed going to make it so that when a permanent spell goes from the graveyard to the stack, you also are not able to track that card using this exception here. In case you're curious, this is the rule that lets cards like Banishing Light or Flicker return the correct permanent to the battlefield after they exile them. Okay, so now let's take a look at the next exception, and we'll take a look at this. It says if effect grants something an ability that lets you cast it, then that other parts of the effect can find that spell after you've cast it and moved it onto the stack. And so this looks like it could be pretty promising again, except let's notice that the Serra Paragon is not granting an ability that lets you cast a card from your graveyard. Rather, it's modifying the game rules so that you're able to cast a card from your graveyard. So this exception is also not able to help us track the card when it goes from the graveyard to the stack. In case you were wondering, this exception is the reason why if you play a card from your graveyard with Snapcaster Mage's Flashback, then that spell will still have the Flashback ability on the stack. And that's important because if you were to counter a spell that was cast using Flashback, then that would get exiled and it wouldn't go right back to your graveyard. And so, because of how this rule works, that is in fact exactly what would happen if you were to counter a spell that Snapcaster Mage gave Flashback to. All right, so the next rule that we're going to be looking at is this one here. And it just says if an effect allows you to cast a card, then other parts of that effect can follow that card onto the stack. And this is it. This is exactly what we are looking for. Notice that the Serra Paragon does indeed have an effect that lets you cast a spell from your graveyard, and so that means that other parts of the Serra Paragon's effect can follow that spell onto the stack and be able to access the object that it becomes in that zone. So that is really excellent. That means that if we can at least find some way for the spell to get tracked onto the battlefield, then we've completed our assignment and we are able to justify the permanent on the battlefield having that ability that the Serra Paragon wants it to have. At least in the case of casting a spell from your graveyard. Playing a land from your graveyard remains problematic. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of the ways that we might be able to do that. We'll start out with this rule here, which indicates that permanents on the battlefield are able to reference information about the spells that turn into those permanents. And unfortunately, this isn't going to really help us out here because the permanent on the battlefield is not trying to look for any information about the spell that turned into that permanent. Rather, we need something that allows a change in the spell that became that permanent to propagate onto the permanent. We aren't looking for or asking for any information about that spell. We just need stuff that happened to the spell to be able to also happen to the permanent too. In case you're wondering, this rule here is the reason why triggered abilities that trigger if you paid a kicker cost, like for example what you might see on Archangel of Wrath, are able to look at the spell on the stack and see whether you did pay a kicker cost, and if so, which ones. Alright, and finally we're going to get to the Grand Kahuna, and this is the probably most promising one that a lot of people are probably going to be looking at. And this one says that if you have an effect from a spell, activated ability, or triggered ability that changes the characteristics of a permanent spell on the stack, then you are able to propagate those changes onto the permanent that spell becomes. And that is really promising. That's exactly the sort of thing that we're trying to do to get that triggered ability that says when this dies, exile me, that Serra Paragon wants that permanent to have when it's on the battlefield. Except there's just one little issue with that, and that is that we do not have Serra Paragon giving that triggered ability to the creature via the effects of a spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. Rather, Serra Paragon has a static ability that wants to grant that ability to the permanent once it's on the battlefield. And unfortunately, that is not one of the things that is covered under this sentence here. So, but wait, there's more. We can actually keep reading, and this is the next part that we're going to read is actually what they added in to help Henzi Tor function within the rules when a similar technical issue with its functioning was discovered. So let's take a look and see if the sentence that they added in for that card is going to help us out here. And so it says that if a static ability, okay, we're starting out pretty good, gives an ability to a spell, yes, that's exactly what we're trying to do, that lets it be cast. And this is where the thing kind of falls apart because, again, the Serra avatar did not give an ability to the spell that let it be cast. Rather, the Paragon changed the rules of the game that enabled you to cast it from a different zone. We didn't give an ability to the card that lets you cast it. We just changed the rules of the game so that you could cast it normally without it having some kind of special ability. And it is a pedantic distinction, but it is a difference nonetheless. And because we do not have exactly the case that's described under this clause of the CR either, then that means it is also not applicable, and it is also not able to transmit the triggered ability of when this dies, exile me and gain 2 life onto the permanent on the battlefield from the stack. And so those are all of the examples that, in my opinion, could be construed at all to be able to help us out in this situation. There are a few more examples, and I'll throw those up on screen so that you can confirm that they don't really have anything to do with this situation here. But that is the issue, and that is what the problem is. Now let's take a little bit of time and think about what we might be able to do in order to get this card to work. And I think what a lot of people have maybe suggested as maybe the cleanest way to fix this issue would be to do something like what we had for Rivaz in the exact same set. And so what we can see on this card here is we have a triggered ability that says whenever you cast a dragon spell from your graveyard at all, then it's going to gain this ability of when this dies, exile it. Okay, and so let's take a short time to examine how this functions and make sure that it does function. Notice that the Rivaz is giving a ability to the permanent spell on the stack, and it is doing so via the effect of a resolving triggered ability. So that means that it does fall under the exception that we talked about just previously here. And so what that means is that it is able to change the characteristics of the permanent spell on the stack and have those characteristics be changed the exact same way once the permanent has gone onto the battlefield, which is exactly what we want. So it would be pretty simple to do something similar to that with the Serra Paragon. All we would need to do would be to say, for example, change the if you do line of text to when you do. And if we were to make that sort of a change, then we would also have this property where the Serra Paragon is giving the when this dies, exile and you gain 2 life ability to the permanent via the effect of a resolving triggered ability. And so that would mean it would be covered under that same exception that allows Rivaz to work. However, I'm not really sure if I would say that this is the fix that I think we should do. And the reason for that is because, well, if it is a spell that we're working with, well, that's okay. I think that it works precisely the same way as Rivaz does, and I think that there isn't really anything problematic with the way Rivaz works as regards to the spells. Let's notice that the triggered ability from Rivaz triggers when you cast the spell, and so therefore it would resolve before the spell itself resolves. And so since we have modified the characteristics of the spell, there is no point in time when the permanent that spell becomes is on the battlefield and it does not yet have that ability. And that's a really good property. Unfortunately, the Serra Paragon also allows you to play lands, and when we try to change this in this way, we run into an issue if you were going to play a land. That issue would be that if you play a land from your graveyard, then the triggered ability is going to trigger after you play the land from your graveyard, and it's going to go on the stack. And if the land has any abilities that you can activate, then you could respond to that triggered ability that gives the land the thing that makes you exile it, and the land would already be in your graveyard by the time the triggered ability tried to give that to the land. And so we could see, for example, a play where someone might play a wasteland from their graveyard and then respond to the triggered ability that gives it the when this dies, you have to exile me, by wastelanding one of your opponent's lands. And then, of course, next turn you could make the exact same play until your opponent didn't have any lands anymore. Fetch lands have a similar sort of an issue that allows them to get some extra value with that. And so I'm pretty sure that neither of these play patterns is something that Wizards is going to want to endorse here. So really, if we were going to errata the Serra Paragon this way, I feel like that probably is not the best way to fix it. There probably is some more complicated errata that you could put on this card that would make it function as intended and also close that loophole, but I'm not sure if that's the way that I would want to go with this. I feel like, especially given the example of Henzi Tor a few months ago that had a very similar technical issue, I feel like there's, it's not a good plan to change just a little bit on the card in order to make it work the way we say it's supposed to work. Rather, I think that it's probably the best if we could look at what we're actually trying to do and make a change in Magic's rules that gives us the capability to plan for if we wanted some similar sort of effect in the future. And so maybe what we could do is add a couple of more rules in the exceptions that might cover this case. For example, we might have a sentence that says effects that let you cast a card can also find the spell that card becomes, and then maybe they can also find the permanent that spell becomes after it resolves, if applicable. Whatever they do, they're going to have to be very careful to word these in a very specific way, because as you noticed, small changes in the wording actually lead to big changes in the outcomes. One specific outcome that I think is very important to avoid would be if you worded it in such a way that the continuous effect from Serra is continuing to apply to the permanent that's on the battlefield, which would imply that if the Serra were to, for example, leave the battlefield, then the stuff that you brought back with that Serra would not have the when this dies exile ability anymore. And I'm pretty sure that's not the intent of the card. I'm pretty sure that it's intended that after you play it from your graveyard, it has perpetually the ability that makes it so you have to exile it if it ever dies. So you would want to be sure to word any proposed changes in the rules in such a way that that would not be an issue. Unfortunately, the thing that we added onto 400.7a with Henzi Tor actually does suffer from exactly the same problem. And if you wanted a few more details about that, you could check out my dedicated video where I go all about that. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.